Good morning again, and I hope we are all awake and alert after being very cold and very patient yesterday at Gettysburg. Thank you. I've made the comment before that Africa is leading the rest of the world in many areas in national security, and I know that some may think I'm not serious about that, but I want to offer some examples. And I want to say that because there are practitioners from your countries that are far more qualified to talk about this subject than I am. To mention just a few, National Minister of Defense Brownie Samakai from Liberia, who oversaw the drafting of the first post-war Liberian national security strategy. National Security Advisor Ismail Tarawali from Sierra Leone, who was part of the process for establishing a robust national security strategy in that country in the post-conflict reconstruction and transition. General Shiziku, more recently, Generals Shiziku and Namangali from Malawi, who are in the process of helping the government of President Banda develop a robust process for crafting and publicizing and implementing a national security strategy for Malawi. I have worked with all of these individuals, and I have learned far more from them than they ever learned from me. And I make this point because most of you are actively involved in these processes right now. All of you will be, and I encourage you to learn from each other. National security strategy and policy is unique to each country. Each country approaches it in ways that are characterized by its traditions, its political processes, its systems, and its needs. But there are common lessons that I think can be learned and shared, and I hope that you will do that. I'd mention my colleagues from Gabon, Niger, and Namibia, who were in my discussion group, who have already shared some of their processes and lessons learned in our online discussion of national security strategy. And I would encourage the rest of you to do the same thing. My observation in working with national security strategy and policy is that this field is moving faster in Africa than in any other region of the world. If you'd had these kind of conversations 10 years ago, most African countries, most partners in Africa would have said, well, either we don't have a policy or strategy, or we have one, but we can't tell you what it is because it's secret, or we haven't really thought about that yet. That's certainly not the case today. Across the continent, governments, some have long-established processes that they are refining and moving forward. Many states are establishing those processes for the first time. And why are they doing that? They're doing that because of a growing understanding that the collection of threats and challenges that we spent the last week talking about require a coherent strategy from the state to protect the state, to protect its citizens, to protect its national interests. And that process is generating a broad spectrum of approaches to developing and implementing national security strategy. And while they are different in each African state, there are some characteristics of the approach to national security in Africa that differ from the approach that you'll see in Europe or in the United States, in the West in general. And those differences generally fall into three areas. First of all, most of these African approaches embrace human security. Embrace the idea that national security includes a component that is oriented on protection of the safety and security and interests of individual citizens and of the communities that those citizens live in. Secondly, African approaches recognize that domestic issues and security challenges are just as important or more important than the traditional foreign policy security challenges, which still tends to be the focus for the Western donors. When Europeans or Americans or Canadians talk to you about national security policy and strategy, they're typically thinking about it in foreign policy terms. And there are only a few exceptions to that. One of them is France, and I'm going to talk to the French experience in a little bit of detail because I think it's one of the most valuable experiences among the Western actors that states in Africa can learn from. The third area that approaches to national security strategy in Africa differ from the rest of the world is that they tend to embrace participative processes with broad consultation with the public. And by definition, they tend to be far more open and far more transparent than those processes among the external actors. Again, France is a bit of an outlier here, but for the other Europeans and for the Americans, and certainly for the Chinese and the rest of the BRICS, national security is something that's done in secret by small groups, that's not shared with the public, at least not until it's published, and sometimes not even then, and in which there's very little effort to involve the public in the development of that strategy. That has not been the approach in Africa. The hallmark of approaches in Africa have been transparency, inclusiveness, and participation. Not all, but a significant number. Okay, what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about what a strategy is and why we need it, and my good friend Patrick has already talked about that a little bit. I'm also going to talk about what national security is. Remember the question, whose security are we concerned with here? And we're going to talk a little bit about that, about what national security means. We're going to talk about national security strategy and policy, what it is, why we develop it, what it's designed to accomplish. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about national interests, strategic ends or objectives, and national security strategy, what the relationship between those three are, because that's a very, very important relationship for us to understand. And then finally, I'm going to give you some examples of different national security processes. Two from the West, one from the United States, one from France, two from Africa, one from South Africa, one from Liberia. And the point of these examples is to demonstrate both the differences and the commonalities across countries in how you approach national security strategy. Okay, why do we need a strategy, and what is it? Well, at its most basic, a strategy is how you get from point A to point B. And it's got three real core pieces. One is where you're going, that's your objectives. One is how you're going to get there, that's your ways. And one is the resources that you're going to use along the way. And balancing those three is the strategic art. Now, why do we need it? You know, there's a great children's book, a novel that some of you may be familiar with by Lewis Carroll called Alice in Wonderland. And in this novel, Alice is magically transported to a strange and unfamiliar land. And she finds herself on a road at a fork that has several different roads leading off. And she doesn't know where she is. She doesn't know anything about this new strange place that she's found herself. But there's a resident of this land there. And so Alice asks the resident, well, which road should I take? And the resident says, well, where are you trying to go? And Alice says, I don't know where I'm trying to go. I don't know anything about this land. I have no idea where I am. And the resident says, well, then it doesn't much matter which road you take, does it? To which Alice responds, oh, but I want to get somewhere. And the resident says, well, just pick a road and start walking. You're bound to get somewhere. And of course, the question for us as practitioners is that somewhere I want to get to? And in a nutshell, that's what strategy is for. National Security Lexicon. One of the reasons that Patrick and I asked you to read the decaf piece on national security policy is that it kind of gets past this quibbling over what you call it. National security policy and national security strategy are essentially the same thing. Europeans tend to call it national security policy. Canadians and Americans tend to call it national security strategy. And experts or practitioners like me will argue about, what's policy, what's strategy. Trust me, they mean the same thing. And arguing about what's the difference between strategy and policy is kind of like the Catholic cardinals arguing about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. We're all practitioners. We all know what it is. It's ends, ways, and means that get us to where we want our country to go. Having said that, words matter. And in Africa, one of the interesting dimensions to the development of national security strategy is that Africans are starting to call it by different names. And they're very interesting names. Human security strategies, development strategies. Liberia crafted something called a poverty reduction strategy, within which more traditional national security strategy was nested. And those words matter. They reflect, I believe, an understanding on the part of African partners and African states that whose security we're talking about matters, and that it is the security of our citizens and our communities as much or more than the security of the state or the security of the regime. Those are important, but equally or more important, as the Kenyans learned in the elections in 2007, equally important is the security of our individual citizens and their communities and the confidence they have that they can conduct their business in safety. This is a sea change in how we define national security. And I will tell you, you are ahead of the donors. You are ahead of the Europeans and the Americans, who still, with very, very few exceptions, tend to live in the Cold War, when national security strategy was about defending the state from invasion, about, how many tanks my neighbor has. It was about East versus West. The donors are slowly coming to understand that definition has changed. In Africa, that understanding has progressed much more quickly, which I think reflects the fact that in some areas, indeed, Africa is leading the world. And this area is one of them. Okay, defining national security strategy. What is national? You remember the question, whose security are we talking about? Well, there's some things that are kind of common to all definitions of security. One of them is that it's a collective good. Now, that's kind of obvious to most of us, but I think it bears thinking about. You can't really divide it up into global, regional, national, and local pieces anymore, because one of the things we're coming to understand is that security is interconnected. And security issues at the global and regional level have a direct and immediate impact on security issues at the national and local level, and vice versa. That's an interesting phrase there, localizing consequences of failed security. What I mean by that is it's proving not just hard, but really impossible to look at an area where you have a serious security problem and say, well, we're going to build a big fence around it, and we're going to keep all those security problems inside there, and the rest of us are going to go our merry way and not worry about it. And one of the lessons, I remember the conversations we had about 10 months ago at one of our countering violent extremism events with several of your counterparts from East Africa, and we were celebrating the defeat of Shabab, because at the time, AMISOM had accomplished some things that its predecessors over the previous 20 years had been unsuccessful at. And the observation of the African partners was, well, hey, to the United States and the Europeans, was, hey, wait a minute. Where do you think those Shabab guys are going to go if you put the hammer down on them in Somalia? And not getting much of an answer from the donors. The answer from our partners in East Africa is, we know where they're going to go. They're going to show up in our capital city. They're going to show up at our doorstep. This isn't just about Somalia, and it's not just about Shabab. We collectively need to be thinking about these problems. And one of the challenges of national security strategy as a concept is that the very phrase tends to form it in a national context. And security today is much broader. It goes down, it has a local context. It goes up, it has a sub-regional context, as the several groups of you have found in dealing with cattle rustling, for example. And what you find is you have to have collaborative approaches to cattle rustling that's going on in your border areas and is moving back and forth, because the cattle rustlers figure out very, very quickly that there's a real advantage to moving back and forth across the border. So one of the challenges here is national security, regardless of what you call it, it really isn't national anymore. It's local, national, sub-regional, regional, and global. And how do you incorporate that reality in a planning and strategy development and strategy implementation process that really lives inside a national government? Some of the changes that Africa has offered to the world, if you look at the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS has a security process that is more robust and, in my view, more effective than any other intergovernmental organization in the world. It still has flaws, certainly, but ECOWAS has clearly recognized that national security has to be looked at outside a purely national context. Not divisible into external and internal domains. I don't think I need to talk about that. You all understand it better than I do. Nation states no longer the only or even the primary actors. And again, that goes back to how do you incorporate stakeholders in a process that operate outside the nation-state system? And we're struggling with that. And several of your processes are exploring new and innovative approaches to how you draw in stakeholders from outside that nation-state community. Not a zero-sum game. This is one of the real challenges in national security. In winner-take-all systems, where if I win the election, it's my turn to eat, well, I learned that expression from your counterparts, although it's equally true in the United States. But in a zero-sum game where you have winner-take-all politics, the implications for national security strategy are profound. One of the reasons that there is a benefit to involving legislatures in national security processes is that legislatures incorporate the political opposition in ways that executive branches typically do not. So, how you avoid viewing security as a zero-sum game. My gain is your loss. If my district or my country, if my district gets improved security, that means your district gets less security. This was the argument between the North and South in the American Civil War. This, in large part, is at the root of the conflict in Mali. Security as a zero-sum game. We're going to make the South more secure. Automatically, we're going to make the North less secure. That certainly was the perspective of the North. How do you change the process so it's collaborative, so it's collective, so there is a recognition that everybody must benefit? Because if you carve out losers and say, well, we're going to provide security to this group, but we're not going to provide security to that group, we all know how that story ends up. So this is one of the challenges as we create new processes, structures, and institutions for crafting national security strategy. Okay, this is probably the most important transition in national security today. A transition from the old national security. And what was the old national security about? It was about state security. But state security really isn't what it was about. It was about regime survival. It was about making sure that the president stayed the president, making sure that my political party that is in power now stays in power. It was focused on state and regime survival. And from the West, and this is not true in Africa, but it was certainly true in Europe and the United States. It's certainly true in China. I would argue it's true for Brazil and India as well. It's about the security of my state versus the security of my neighbors. and states that I see as hostile to my interests. It was a state versus state concept in a world in which conflict was defined by the First and Second World War, by the Cold War, by the competition for survival between different nation states. That's the old concept of national security. The new concept of national security says, okay, there is a state security component, because if the state's not secure and the state can't perform its functions of delivering services to its citizens, then clearly there isn't going to be security for anybody. But beyond that, there is another concept, another foundational idea for national security, and that is human security. That is the idea of citizen-centric community, citizen-centric security. Whose security do I care about? I care about individual citizens. I care about the people who vote in our elections. I care about the communities that make up our country. All the communities, not just a few of them. The emphasis is shifting from external challenges, which is a euphemism for saying I'm worried about the tanks from my neighboring country rolling across my border and invading me, to domestic issues. And a shift from purely physical security, i.e. guys and gals with AK-47s, broadening that to employment, health care, public sanitation, economic opportunity. All of these are part of the security dimension. And that broadening changes who is involved with security, who's a stakeholder, who is going to influence employment, access to health care in a particular part of my country, in my communities, in my state. Is it going to be the armed forces? Is it going to be the military? Maybe it is in some respects, but certainly not by itself. So this shift in focus fundamentally changes how we think about national security and how we approach it. And this shift is concentrated in Africa. Everybody else is following. The United States, a little funny, the United States continues to insist on national security as almost exclusively a foreign policy concept. And I'll tell you, frankly, that hasn't worked out very well for us. And we're struggling with the reality that Al-Qaeda, terrorism, drugs are every bit as much a local problem as they are an international and global problem. And we're struggling with how to deal with that. Okay. One of the points that I used to make when I actually had a real job, and I taught at the Army War College, to my students was that, okay, yes, strategy is about ends, that's your objectives. It's about ways, how you use your resources, and it's about means, your resources. But ends matter. And at the strategic level, ends matter most. I'll say that again. At the strategic level, ends matter most. Ultimately, it's about where you are going. So if you look at this as a simple model, a three-legged stool, and each one of the stools is a different part of this equation. One leg of the stool is objectives or ends. One leg of the stool is resources. And we're not just talking about money here. We're talking about people. We're talking about military forces, police. We're talking about administrative structures for enforcing the law. We're talking about your judicial system. We're talking about legislation. All the things that you sort of give to the practitioner and that he is going to weave together in his concept or way to accomplish his objective. And of course, the idea is that these have to be in balance. If they are out of balance, that's when you generate risk. And to give a concrete example here, let's say that your end is a secure border area. Okay, you figured out that's my objective. So I do my analysis and I figure out this is how I'm going to do it. This is how I'm going to employ my police and my customs and my military. And then I look at my resources and my resource guy says, okay, it's going to take Up here, it's going to take 3,000 military and 1,000 police and 500 customs agents. To which you'll look at your basket of means and say, well, I don't have that. I only have 2,000 military available, and I only have about 100 custom agents, and I've only got about 250 police. So I don't have enough of the resources. So what am I going to do? Well, one thing you can do is go back and look at how you were going to use those resources and see if you can find a way to use them in different ways that will give you the same impact with 1,500 soldiers that your original strategy said you needed 5,000 soldiers for. So that's one way to address this. Another way to address it is changing my ends. Say, well, you know what? Maybe I'm just going to be concerned about border security in this province, And maybe I'm not going to worry about border security over there. You guys over there, I don't have enough resources, so you're on your own. Yeah, states actually do that, of course. United States never does. No, we wouldn't do that. But of course, if you're changing your ends, what's happening? Remember what the purpose of the strategy was. The purpose of the strategy was to get from point A to point B. Well, I don't have enough to get to point B, so, maybe I'll go somewhere else. Always ask what the end state is. What's the objective? What are the ends that I am trying to accomplish? Okay. National interests and national security strategy. Ends are pretty clear cut. Okay, that's your objectives. That is what you want to accomplish. That's what you want the world to look like if your strategy is successful. So what are national interests? National interests tell you why you want the world to look that way. And more specifically, they tell you not only why you want it to work that way, they tell you why you care, but they also tell you how much you care. And that's why you take a national interest and you find some way to prioritize it. In the American system, what we typically talk about are vital interests, important interests, and peripheral interests, which is another way of saying some interests are more important than others. Now, why does this matter? Well, let's go back to our border example. And remember that our objective was a more secure border, right? That's pretty straightforward. We all understand that. Well, why do we want a more secure border? Well, we got a conflict on the other side, like in the Eastern Congo, and we got a lot of fighters and criminals that are coming across the border and killing our citizens and robbing them and keeping them from farming their land. So we've got a citizen security national interest here. We got a national interest in preserving the safety of our citizens that live in that area. But we also have an economic interest in the free flow of goods and services across that border, so that our farmers can take their coffee to the market, so that we can see investment and resources flowing to the factories on our side of the border. And guess what? The things that we do to increase the safety of our citizens by preventing those guys and gals with guns from crossing the border, by making it harder to move across the border, that may also make it harder for goods and services to move across the border. That may affect our economic interests in negative ways. And in some cases, cattle rustling is a great example. The negative impact in economic terms may be pretty severe, which is why I need to understand, first of all, that my national interests include both the security of my citizens and the free movement of goods, and I need to understand which one matters most. Because the ways that I select and the resources that I commit may very well have an impact on how securing the border affects those national interests, which is one of the reasons that you always start by asking what I care about and why I care. And then you proceed to crafting objectives. And always go back to the national interests. When you're in the midst of crafting your strategy and you have questions, stop and ask, why am I doing this? Why am I pursuing this end? What national interests, whose national interests am I protecting? And why? Okay. And you're going to have the slides online, hopefully on GlobalNet. Hopefully GlobalNet will work. I put this up just because this is what we use in the senior service colleges, the war colleges in the United States. It is a way of describing the whole process of crafting and implementing national security strategy. A way. It's certainly not the way. There are lots of different ways to do this. Even though it's what we teach, it's not necessarily what we do. What I like about it is it captures in a comprehensive way all the different pieces of the national security process. And in particular, the two columns on left and right, domestic influences that you have to think about. And I know you can't read the slide. And then on the left, the yellow column, those are sort of the external influences and actors and agencies that affect this process for us in our particular country. I encourage you to print this one off, to take it back with you. Your process isn't going to look like this, okay? It's going to be different for every one of your countries. But I find this useful as a vehicle for just thinking about all the different pieces of the process. Okay. So no matter what process you end up with, there are certain questions that we all have to answer. Question number one, who's going to be in charge? And the first answer to that is pretty simple, usually, in most countries. It's going to be the executive branch. That's not very helpful. Unless the president or prime minister is personally going to sit down and run this, which isn't very likely, then the question is, who in the executive branch is really going to have control of the process and be responsible for moving the process forward? That's a real interesting question, especially in a world where police, customs, immigration may be just as important as the armed forces or more important. And who's going to control the national security process? And how are you going to ensure that they're all players? Who are the participating stakeholders? And who are the intended audiences? Two different questions. First of all, who's going to be involved in helping to develop this process? In the executive branch, how many of your agencies? Is this going to be entirely military? Are you going to have a partnership between military and law enforcement? Are you going to involve the justice system? Are you going to involve the Ministry of Finance? Are you going to involve the Ministry of Public Works? Are you going to involve stakeholders outside the government? Are you going to involve the legislature? That's a particularly important question. What role will the legislative branch and the executive branch have in developing national security strategy and in overseeing its implementation? Now we get that. That was the first question. Who are the stakeholders? Second question. Who are you drafting it for? Who's going to read it? In the United States, during the early stages of the developing of national security strategies, they were secret. They were developed by the executive branch, by a very, very small group. They were not released publicly. Who was that intended for? That was intended for the executive branch. It was intended to be guidance to members of that executive branch. Here's the guidance from your president on what kind of strategy he wants you guys to implement. But maybe you've got a bigger audience than that. Maybe your audience is the public, to inform the people of what your strategy is and explain why you developed it that way, what it's designed to accomplish. What's the advantage of that? In a democracy, the advantage of that is the people understand why you're doing the things you do. They understand why you're spending the money that you want to spend on the police forces. They understand why you're pursuing the policies in the border areas that I talked about, restricting the flow of people with guns, trying to improve the flow of goods and services. to the extent the people better understand the strategy and why the strategy is being implemented in a functional democracy, the people are more likely to support the strategy and the measures that the strategy embraces. And where the strategy is contentious, where the issues the strategy is trying to address are really tough issues, like the issues of integrating two sides after a civil war, like the issues of facilitating a political transition to a new state and a new government that is more inclusive. Public understanding of those policies may be critically important. Maybe you're writing for external partners. Maybe you're publishing the strategy so the states around you. The United States does this a lot. We certainly expect that the Chinese are going to read our national security strategy, and when we write it, we keep that in mind. So maybe it's a means of communicating with your neighbors, not just your adversaries. Maybe it's a means of communicating with your neighboring states that are going to have to collaborate with you to address mutual problems. Maybe they are potential adversaries. Maybe external partners like the European Union and the UN and the Americans, who have a lot of money and a lot of resources and are always here to help. On behalf of whose interests? Whose interests are we serving when we show up at your door with assistance? Number one, are we serving yours? Probably not. We're a democracy. We serve the interests of our voters. Well, if you don't know where you're going, if you haven't articulated for yourselves what your strategy is and how you want to get there, how are you going to make sure that the donors, when they show up with assistance, are going to be providing that in ways that reinforce what you're trying to accomplish? What's the drafting process? Now we get down to us. All this strategic stuff is all very well. But at some point, you got to put pen to paper. You have to actually write the damn thing, and then you got to figure out how to refine it. We are the ones who are going to have to do that, which means you have to think about how it's physically going to be drafted. Who's going to actually write the thing? Is it going to be a team effort? Are you going to have different pieces that are farmed out to different agencies, one to the police, one to the Ministry of the Interior, one to the Ministry of Defense? And if you do it that way, how are you going to combine those inputs into a cohesive whole? Who funds? Big problem, national security strategy. This is everywhere. There is typically a disconnect between ends and ways on the one hand and means, specifically funding, on the other. Why is that? Because ends and ways are primarily the responsibility of executive branches. Funding is primarily the responsibility of legislatures. So what's the outcome in most cases? In most cases, the outcome is national security strategies that essentially ignore the resourcing issues. This is an endemic problem everywhere. It's one of the biggest challenges that you all are grappling right now in your approach to this. Okay, I got about 5 minutes left, so I want to give a couple of examples. And as I give these examples, my point here is they're all different, but you can learn from all of them. You can learn from the examples that are bad, just like you can learn from the examples that are good. You can learn from processes that aren't particularly successful, just as you can learn from processes that are much more so. And hopefully most of the learning is going to be from each other. So let's start with the Americans. U.S. national security strategy dates from 1987, actually. It is externally and state-focused. It is not domestically focused. It is a foreign policy document. It is not focused on human security. It is focused on traditional Cold War national security definitions. How's it working for us? Not very well. It's required by law. Passed a law back in 1987. Congress passed it. Said, hey, you guys in the White House, we want you to do this. Actually, they said, we want you to do it every year. And we want you to send it to us because we want to see what you think about strategy. Now, one of the big advantages of this is that it gives you some continuity from administration to administration. And so as political administrations change, as parties change, you have a process that lives past the change of government, to the extent that the White House pays attention to it, which sometimes, in our case, the White House does, and sometimes it doesn't, depending on how many votes it has in Congress. Produced by the Executive Office of the President, and I should add, okay, I'm speaking for myself. I'm not a spokesman for the American government, and people who have been involved in this process on the U.S. side are probably going to tell you, no, that's not true. It's all whole of government. I'm telling you, it's not whole of government. It's focused inside the Executive Office of the President, it always has been, with not very much consultation outside that. It's been a very secretive process. Now, the good news of a process that's not very transparent, that's inside the head of state's office, is that you get a very close association with the views and priorities of the guy in charge, whether he's the president or the prime minister. And there is a real benefit, especially if that strategy is designed to help direct the executive branch. No public consultation at all in national security strategy development in the United States. Never has been. That's part of that is that national security has always been viewed in the United States, as with most of our European partners, as kind of a secret process that the executive branch is responsible for, that the public really shouldn't be involved in. In retrospect, looking at the world today, sounds kind of nutty. Yes, it does. And the United States is starting to deal with that. And the process is starting to change. Let me go on to the next one. South Africa. If you want to look at a really good example, look at the white paper on national defense for the Republic of South Africa, Defense in a Democracy, published in 1996, 2 years after the transition to black majority rule. Yes, it's a defense white paper, which means by definition it's kind of not whole of government, but it's a great example of a document that was trying to address a really, really difficult transition. A transition that was difficult politically, difficult economically, difficult in security terms. It was developed by the Ministry of Defense, so it wasn't wholly government, but it was internally focused with significant human security content. This was in 96. This was a while ago. It said what we really care about when we look at our defense sector is how it's serving the needs of our people, of our citizens, of our communities. It's focused on supporting the transition to black majority rule. That's kind of important. The strategy wasn't focused on making the trains run on time or on making my military more capable in combat. It was focused on supporting the political end of a transition, a major political watershed to black majority rule. Remember, at the ends matter, and at the strategic level, ends matter most. Collaborative process. The Parliament was involved in this with the executive branch. It was a partnership. That becomes particularly important because even though it didn't incorporate a formal funding piece, because the Parliament was involved, the elements of the strategy influenced prioritization of resources by the Parliament. And there was extensive public consultation. This is one of the first processes where the new black majority rule government said, the people have a stake in this process. They deserve to know about it. It needs to be transparent, and ultimately they need to buy into it. Okay, France. For my money, if you're looking for an example in the West of a national security strategy process, the best example to look at is the French example, which began with the first instance in 1994, was refined in 2007, and this process was just completed more recently in 2013 because the administration of President Hollande said, the world has changed. Things are different. We need to go back and look at what we did in 2007 and figure out how we need to adjust to that. Now, what's striking about the French approach? First of all, it doesn't distinguish between internal and external, between domestic and foreign policy. It sees them as all part of a single security equation. It combined both human security and state security. It very much embraced the idea of whose security we're talking about is the citizens and the communities, but we're also talking about securing the state's ability to function. It was produced by an independent commission. This one's kind of important. It's very interesting. This is a commission that was constituted as a separate body to oversee the crafting of the strategy. It worked and answered directly to the president. That's kind of important because the closer the affiliation between the process and the guy that's in charge, the better that process reflects the priorities of the person that the people elected to run the country. Broad public participation. This is kind of interesting. France is almost alone in the developed West in this one. They said, look, the public needs to be involved. It needs to be transparent. It needs to involve consultation. We need to ask our citizens what they think about this issue, these issues, what they think the risks are, and then we need to incorporate that in the strategy. Okay, I think I'll leave it at that and go on to the last example, my personal favorite, the example of Liberia. Liberia has several national security processes, and they're very different. We start with 2006, okay? And if you remember, this thing came out in April. This was right after President Johnson Sirleaf had been inaugurated. She won the election in late 2005, and so in 2006, you have, and at the risk of saying something controversial, you have the first government in the history of that country that genuinely reflected the will of the people. The first government in which the legislature did what legislatures were supposed to do, independently of the executive branch. The first government in which you had checks and balances and separation of powers, real separation of powers. And the first government in which you had elected officials who paid more than just lip service to a constitution. Now, the problem Johnson Sirleaf had is she needs guidance for her executive branch right now. Decisions have to be made immediately. A long process of crafting a national security strategy would be nice. Gee, nice to have, folks, but I'm the Minister of National Defense. I'm the Inspector General of Police. I need guidance right now on what the issues are, what your intent is for me, what the strategic vision is for our country. So President Johnson Sirleaf, with a very, very small group operating inside her office, crafted a 150-day action plan. It was very practical. It was focused on the immediate future, and it said, here's whose security we care about, here's who the stakeholders are, and here's my end states. For the next 180 days, here are my markers for what I want you all to do and where I want the country to be in 6 months. And I will tell you, because I was there, this was critically important to the senior officials of President Johnson Sirleaf's government. They kept this thing, they looked at it, and it shaped the decisions they made in that terribly, terribly difficult and sensitive initial period following the inauguration of the new, essentially a new democratic state. So in 2007, a year later, Johnson Sirleaf says, well, we need a more elaborate process. And that process isn't going to be a national security strategy. It's going to be a poverty reduction strategy. And the very phrase defined what the Johnson Sirleaf administration saw as the critical national interests confronting the state of Liberia in 2007. It was developed over a much longer period. It was whole of government. It involved all the agencies and stakeholders. It had substantial public consultation with town meetings all over the country that say, what do you think? What do you think the issues are? And that shaped how it was drafted. The National Security Strategy, which Brownie Samakai oversaw, was drafted following the poverty reduction strategy as a component of that strategy. So those are three different ways to approach this. And this is my last slide, and I'll just make the comment. If the strategy sits on a shelf and nobody uses it, it's not going to help you much in getting from point A to point B. National security processes are about more than publishing a document. They are about implementing the will of the elected leaders of the state to actually realize those objectives. Those processes also have to help the state make critical decisions, sometimes very, very quickly, about crises that affect national security. And in some cases, those decisions have a lot of actors that need to be involved in both making them and implementing them. So on that note, I apologize for going longer than I had anticipated. I hope that you have some good comments and questions. I encourage you in the next 40 minutes, share your experiences. Share with all of us how this process works in your country. So share with each other and with me, because I'd certainly like to hear what your experiences have been. Okay, thank you.